Hey everybody, so today on Historical Perspective I want to talk about a top 10 list I saw on WatchMojo. For those who don't know, WatchMojo is our website that puts out these top 10 lists every day. They're usually on culture, movies, music, those kinds of things. But now in this instance they did something with a lot of historical bearing. They have their top 10 most embarrassing presidential moments. And when they say embarrassing, they really mean scandalous, because these are major things that really hurt administrations. And so I wrote down the whole list here, and I'm going to go through it and tell you what I think of each entry, and then I'm going to add some things where I feel like they sort of missed out. I don't know who put this list together, whether it was reporters or historians. They don't really say for sure. They just say the people watch Mojo, whoever that is. They claim to have like 80 independent people they go to for these things. But overall, I want to preface everything I say. This isn't a bad list. This is actually, I would say, a fairly competent list. There's a lot of major scandals that really belong on here on this list, and a lot of things that make a lot of sense to be on the list. In fact, when they get to number one, I actually really agree with them. But we'll get into that. And so I do feel it's a good list. It's not a perfect list, and it's subjective. Of course, this is subjectivity. And so I'd like to go through the list and talk about what's on here, what should have been on here in my opinion. Maybe, I don't know what I'd have bumped out. I really didn't think that far ahead. But the point is, I'm just going to go through the list. So let's start out. Number 10, George W. Bush and the mission accomplished moment on the USS Abraham Lincoln. So let's remember 2003, George W. Bush lands on the USS Abraham Lincoln, got the big mission accomplished banner behind him, and he says the Iraq War is over. And 10 years later, the hostilities finally officially ended, and we still fight in Iraq today, as I make this video in 2015. So clearly the mission was not accomplished, as 12 years later there's still stuff going on. This might be a good one for the list. I mean, it sort of encapsulates Bush's foreign policy faux pas in the Iraqi war, and the things that eventually sunk Republicans in 2006 and 2008, which also had a lot to do with the economy. So maybe, this is maybe just said really the secret of torture or the Patriot Act or anything like that that might have made Bush unpopular. This is like a nice moment to point to. It's hard. I mean, it's a story of like 20 to 30 years of perspective. And so, maybe this will be in 20, 30 years, like, oh no, this was a perfect entry for the list. But as it is, I'm not sure that this is the moment we'll remember as the most embarrassing thing George W. Bush ever did, the most scandalous thing he ever did. So anyway, moving on. Number 9, Thomas Jefferson and the Embargo Act of 1807. So in 1807, Thomas Jefferson passes this Embargo Act that totally cuts off trade with England. No exporting, no importing, because they were impressing American soldiers. This eventually led to the War of 1812. And here was the problem. When they put on the Embargo Act, instantly the economy fell to pieces. Just nobody had jobs in harbors, almost shutting down harbors. This was the number one trade partner, so you really couldn't do this. And well, my first thought on this is, yeah, this is very bad for Jefferson, but in 1808, his right hand, James Madison, who was Secretary of State, wins the election. So clearly it didn't cost them so much that they didn't win the election in 1808. And honestly, for Jefferson, during his administration, as embarrassing as anything, definitely as embarrassing as the Embargo Act, was Aaron Burr, his vice president for his first 4 years. I mean, he shot and killed Alexander Hamilton while he was vice president. So that's pretty scandalous. That's a little hard to overcome. And then in the second Jefferson administration, Aaron Burr is tried for treason. He was supposed to be trying to separate part of the Louisiana Purchase into its own nation, so he gets tried for treason. And for the first time in history, Jefferson invoked executive privilege not to give evidence in that case that might have actually sunk Burr. It was kind of a sketchy case. You'd have to read into it more yourself. But the point is that Aaron Burr may have easily been as scandalous and embarrassing for Jefferson as was the Embargo Act of 1807. Number 8, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the Japanese internment camps. This is very embarrassing looking back. As Americans, I think we can all be embarrassed by taking several of our own citizens and putting them in internment camps during World War II for 4 to 5 years. It lasted till after the war was over, lasted like 1946, when they finally let the last people out. And so, yeah, this one's bad. But here's my thing with this. As bad as it is now, at the time, very few people questioned this practice, unless you were living near a Japanese family who got taken, or you were Japanese. There was very little objection to the Japanese internment camps. It was acceptable in 1942, believe it or not. And as ugly as that is, that's the truth. It really didn't hurt Franklin Roosevelt's popularity to put Japanese people in internment camps. If you want to go for something that hurt his popularity more during his administration, it was when he tried to pack the Supreme Court. Through the mid to late 30s, the Supreme Court was striking down bits and pieces of his New Deal, and so there's nothing in the Constitution that says you can't have 13 Supreme Court members. He tried to just tack on for that he knew would approve the pieces of his New Deal, and people really got upset with Franklin Roosevelt interfering with the works of another branch of the government. You know, we have the three branches, and this is something people got very upset about, was the court packing, much more so than Japanese internment, which retrospectively I think we see as much worse, which is the right attitude. But it was, you know, it was 10, 15, 20 years down the road that people really began to see the sin of the Japanese internment camps. It wasn't until the 80s that those people were given any sort of compensation, a mere $20,000 for their internment. Okay, so moving on. Number 7, Ronald Reagan and the Iran-Contra affair. The Teflon president moment. I also could think about when they were talking about this was the Teflon president. Iran-Contra, for those who don't know, is Reagan illegally dealt with both Iran and shoot, I forget where the Contras, if they're from Honduras or Nicaragua. I can't believe I'm blanking on that. But anyway, the Contras, he illegally dealt with both groups under the table. Oliver North famously was the military man he had in charge of it, and somehow he skated out from underneath all of it. It was a big scandal at the time. Reagan had to go on TV and defend himself and sort of shed this one off. And it was hard, but it was done. And Reagan really didn't suffer that much in popularity. This took place in like 86, 87. And George H.W. Bush, Herbert Walker won in 88. So, and you know, he was his vice president. So clearly not an end-all, beat-all. And the Iran-Contra, though bad, maybe not the worst scandal. Number 6, Woodrow Wilson and the Espionage and Sedition Acts of 1917 and 1918. Instantly, I like this one, and I know really what those acts ended up being used for was the Red Scare post-World War I. They were supposed to be at the time keep people from spying on the United States during World War I, but they stayed in place, and the Red Scare that took place afterwards were rooting out communists. When people think Red Scare, they think post-World War II, but post-World War I had its own Red Scare, and these were the laws. And most people don't realize this, but the Espionage Act is still in place. It's still American law. It's not a good law. It's been watered down some. It probably should be gone altogether. But much like the last few, this one didn't hurt Woodrow Wilson that much in his day. I mean, much more so that hurt him in his day was trying to pass the League of Nations and really trying to force it sort of down the throats of Republican senators at the time. That's actually what they lost the 1920 election. It had very little to do with the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Though they're sort of, let's say this sort of retrospectively, that was a pretty bad thing, much like the internment camps. But moving on, number 5, Bill Clinton and Lewinsky impeachment. I'm going to say this one's overrated. I know Bill Clinton was impeached, could have potentially lost the presidency, could have been the first person ever to lose the presidency. But this felt like political grandstanding. I remember at the time, and I was young, I was just a teenager, but I didn't think they're ever going to actually kick him out of office. Maybe I was naive at the time because I was a teenager, but that's how I felt. Looking back, it still feels like they weren't actually going to do it. They impeached him just to show him up and make sure he couldn't pass any legislation his last couple of years. I think as more time goes by, we'll see this one is more and more overrated, and it was an ugly affair. There's no doubt about it. It was a scandal. It was embarrassing, but I feel like this has been overrated, and it's number 5 on this list. It's number 4. I actually kind of I don't know, I was sort of amused by this one. James Buchanan, his presidency, period. So James Buchanan couldn't stop the Civil War, so just an embarrassment to everything. James Buchanan was the last attempt to elect a compromise candidate by the United States before the Civil War, before it was clear that there was no compromise, and Abraham Lincoln would become president, and finally the conflict that was going to take place took place. I feel like historians, they don't give Buchanan a pass. He's seen as someone who definitely was not a man for his place or time, and he and both Franklin Pierce right before him are both seen as people who were not capable of staving off the Civil War. They were not good leaders. They were not efficient administrators. And I have a hard, this is like, actually to me this is like the worst one on the list. And usually when historians rank the worst presidents, there's like the lowest level, and then there's the level above, and usually that level above those just kind of crappy presidents, Buchanan and Pierce, go there. They don't go in that that lowest of low levels. So, and yeah, the fact that Buchanan's not here without Franklin Pierce actually kind of amuses me, because those 8 years are almost sort of like one long sort of, oh, it's not really happening. This sort of, oh, there's no problems here. All is well, which wasn't true. So okay, number 3, John F. Kennedy and the Bay of Pigs invasion. Yeah, this one was pretty ugly. This is in the first year of Kennedy's administration, and it looks really bad. He looks like a fool, even though it was an Eisenhower idea that Kennedy ran with. The CIA really failed at this one, and it makes Kennedy look tremendously bad. The only thing about this one is the Bay of Pigs, which is where the Cuban expatriates were sent to Cuba trying to overthrow Castro with no air support and very little, and they were just trounced. In fact, the communists had intercepted. They knew they were coming. Just ugly. But then just like a year later, the Cuban Missile Crisis takes place. Kennedy looks like a hero on that, and so I feel like the Bay of Pigs was kind of flushed out fairly quick. It is the reason there's still an embargo with Cuba, and all the relationship with the United States and Cuba is still bad, and only now, 50 plus years later, starting to thaw out. Bay of Pigs has a lot to do with that. Number 2, John Adams and the Alien and Sedition Acts. This is a bad one. I like John Adams. I've talked about in videos before how I like John Adams. But this is a really awful moment. John Adams passes a bill that violates the First Amendment. He says you cannot criticize the president. You'll be fined or thrown in prison. The country was still young, and this was a huge mistake, a huge miscalculation on Adams' part. He really labored over this, and he made the wrong choice. He just flat out made the wrong choice. People weren't sure. Alien Sedition Acts were very common to European, countries with crowns and royalty. It wasn't acceptable in this new democracy, and Adams didn't realize that yet, and he realized it too late. So yeah, this was bad. Number 1, how can you not agree with this one? Richard Nixon and the Watergate scandal. Cost him his administration. He had to resign because of Watergate. He bumbled it badly. And here's the thing about Watergate that I always just boggles my mind. Richard Nixon was not directly involved with the Watergate break-in. He hired people and told them, do what you have to do. And this is what they went and did. They went and tried to bug, Democratic headquarters, and they bungled it because they were bunglers. This whole thing is just ridiculous sort of in its nature. Nixon doesn't find out till after it happens. Now, rather than going to people and saying, I hired these guys, they stepped out of line, I'll take responsibility, I didn't want them to do this, this isn't something that I ordered them to do. He tries to cover it up. He persecutes people, tries to use the FBI, the CIA, whoever he can get in his power to cover it all up. He lies to the American public. Famously, they say Richard Nixon's a crook. Well, I'm here to tell you Richard Nixon's not a crook. He didn't say I'm not a crook. He said Richard Nixon's not a crook. It's just bad. And the fact is that Watergate ended his administration because of the bungling embarrassment and his handling of the situation. If I maintain, just from what I've read historically, that he took responsibility for it the instant it became a thing, he might have actually held on to his presidency. It had been tough, but he could have done it. Okay, so now let me talk briefly, because that's their list, and like I said, it's a solid list, but there were two for sure. I'm sorry, 3. I'm going to go 3. There were 3 for sure I felt could have easily kicked off Buchanan, and maybe even Bush, since we don't really know yet. Clinton, maybe even. Like, there's a few of these things that could have been easily thrown off by these things. And they don't even put them in honorable mentions, but let's start with Warren G. Harding and the Teapot Dome scandal. Warren G. Harding, President of the United States in the 1920s, Harry Doherty, his Attorney General, very corrupt Ohio politicians. They come to the White House and they just keep doing what they were doing, which is using government to make themselves money. And most of it kind of went under the radar, but the Teapot Dome was particularly bad. Albert B. Fall, Secretary of the Interior, allowed private contractors to take government oil and siphon it off for their own profit. Government reserve oil, important strategic government reserve oil that was supposed to be in America's possession no matter what, taken by private companies and turned into profit. That was kicked back to Fall and other people in the administration. That's where the term Fall Guy comes from. And there's only 2 possibilities for Albert Fall. Either he was an ignoramus who didn't realize what was going on, or he was completely corrupt. Now, honestly, from what I've read, the ignoramus is actually fairly credible. Howard Paul didn't realize what he was actually doing. That's pretty bad, and it's happening under Harding's watch. And so Harding, with a handful of other minor scandals, including one stealing money from Veterans Affairs, has to go out on the road in 1923 and defend himself. He's actually on this big train tour trying to tell people, I am not crooked, I swear. I didn't know about any of this. Like, I didn't do any of it, and it's so stressful for me as he stroke and dies. So Warren G. Harding dies. And that's the only thing that saved his administration. The fact that the fact is, I think he had to resign. This would have been Watergate bad had he not died from that stroke. Maybe he holds out till 1924 when the next election comes, but there's no way he runs again. This destroyed him. He was not going to be president any longer after this scandal. So it's on par with Watergate in a way, because it was going to take down Warren G. Harding, the Teapot Dome and the other minor scandals that he had going on underneath him. Another major scandal that didn't make the list that I feel like should have, the Fisk gold cornering scandal under U.S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant, popular general, popular president, but not really a very effective administrator, not even that effective a president despite serving 8 years. And Fisk and Gould, who both know Grant personally, used inside information from his administration to try and corner the gold market, gold, and buy up all the gold in the markets, and it collapsed the economy. They collapsed the economy. They were trying to buy up all this gold because people panicked, and the bottom fell out of everything, and it came back to U.S. Grant. And this is the second half of his 8-year administration, so he'd have to run again, and it was lucky for him because he'd had a hard time overcoming this. This was pretty destructive to him. It made him look like a great big fool, and a lot of people thought a lot less of U.S. Grant when this took place, and it actually cost him financially as well, because he had money with Fisk and Gould, and they lost that money during this crisis. There's a lot of things in the Gilded Age that were really bad economically. There was actually also the Credit Immobile scandal the year before, which Grant wasn't really tied to, but there were several financial scandals throughout the late 19th century. Okay, and the other one that I really felt like should have made this list, Herbert Hoover and the Bonus Marchers. For those who don't know, 1932, there's a bunch of veterans from World War I. They come to the Washington, D.C., they set up a camp, and they're asking for these bonuses that were due to them in a few years into the 1930s. I believe 38 they were due to them. And since it's the Great Depression, they want the money. They're just asking for the money. And Hoover decides to spend General MacArthur down, break up the Bonus Marchers, get them out of here, but don't use violence. MacArthur instantly goes down and burns down their camp. And boy, does it look bad. FDR's top aide said, this has won us the election in 1932. See, people forget, like, the Great Depression happens in 1929, the economy collapses. And so Herbert Hoover had 3+ years to try and turn around the economy and try and resuscitate his reputation. And he had actually done that a little bit. He had a fighting chance in the 1932 election. Like, people act like it was inevitable. It's hard to say that he'd actually won, but he actually had gotten to the point where he had kind of a puncher's chance to win the 32 election. But then this Bonus Marchers happens things shortly, like just a few months before the election. I think it was in the summer, it was in June or July, and the election's in November. It just collapses all hope. He's got no chance of winning after this happens. It completely destroys his administration and any chance he ever had of winning. So, okay, so there's the three that I really felt like should have been on the list. There's a few other ones that I thought, might have made the outskirts of this list, but just thoughts in the back of my mind. John Quincy Adams being elected in the House of Representatives, possibly making a corrupt deal with Henry Clay. It would end up costing him the next election. It belabored his administration. Nobody wanted to work with him. It really cut down any chance of his presidency being effective. Now let's see here. What else do I got here? Andrew Jackson, Indian removal. They mentioned in the honorable mentions the Petticoat Affair for Andrew Jackson, which sort of broke him up from the mainstream in Washington. But I think that since they're doing retrospective things, we have internment and espionage acts. Indian removal by Andrew Jackson was horrifically bad. And the Trail of Tears and all this, and the way the Cherokees were treated, I think people remember that very poorly. And that's something that could have easily made this list. We'll skip over this one here. James Madison, Washington, D.C. was burned in the War of 1812. Now, he still won the election, so that one is what it is. Let's see here. We have Harry Truman and the fall of China in the late 40s, which nearly cost him the 48 election. And the fallout from the Cold War and all that would eventually cost Democrats in 52 to Eisenhower. So fall of China was very bad for Harry Truman. Let's see here. Oh, I have Grover Cleveland of the Pullman strike. The Pullman were violently put down. They struck against the railroads, and Grover Cleveland was behind that. And it really hurt his reputation very badly and made it hard for him to win an office again. He still had a chance, but this made it even harder. The fact the economy fell off also, of course. The economy is always a thing, whether the president wins or loses. Let's see here. Let's see. Okay, Eisenhower and the U-2 in Cuba happened really, Gary Powers' U-2 crashed in the Soviet Union and tried to claim they didn't know anything about him. And of course, Gary Powers came and said, of course they know about me. And then the Cuba falling late in his administration. Both those things happened at similar times. Cold War stuff. And speaking of Cold War stuff, we have here Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, and the Tet Offensive, which made it look like he was prosecuting Vietnam very poorly. Made sure he couldn't run again in '68. Made sure he wouldn't be able to run again. And last, here, Gerald Ford pardoning Richard Nixon. Pardoning Richard Nixon ensured Gerald Ford could not win the presidency on his own in 1976. People never forgave him for that. Pardoning Richard Nixon to most people was just something he may have had to do, but it was an unforgivable act, and it was really scandalous in its time. So that was a lot. I mean, that was a long list, and I tried to go through it, and I tried to give you all my thoughts on the list. Like I said, on the whole, this isn't a bad list. There are some things I disagree with on the list, and I went through that here. Harding's Teapot Dome not being on the list to me is by far and away the most egregious. Hoover's bonus marchers and Grant's fiscal. I could honestly see that being pushed aside a bit, but Harding the Teapot Dome, which was going to cost him his administration, needed to be on this list. So there it is. There's my thoughts on the WatchMojo Most Embarrassing Presidential Moments list. Thank you for listening, and I hope this gives you just a little bit of historical perspective.